What would you do if everything you'd ever worked for disappeared in a single moment? If the dreams you'd spent your entire life chasing were suddenly ripped away by fate's cruel hand? And what if the very thing you thought would destroy your future turned out to be the key to finding your true purpose? This is the story of Dan Smith, a story that will challenge everything you believe about human resilience, the power of love, and the unexpected ways life can surprise us when we least expect it. The chlorine burned Dan's nostrils as he pulled himself out of the pool, water cascading from his muscular frame. Coach Peterson stood at the edge with his stopwatch, a rare smile creasing his weathered face. 2 minutes, 18 seconds, Peterson announced, his voice carrying across the empty natatorium. That's a new personal best, Dan. Keep this up, and Tokyo won't just be a dream anymore. Dan's heart hammered against his ribs, not from the exertion, but from the electricity of possibility, the 2024 Olympics. He'd been chasing that goal since he was 8 years old, standing on the pool deck at the local YMCA in Des Moines, watching older kids cut through the water like dolphins. Now at 22, he was closer than ever to making that childhood fantasy a reality. "Thanks, Coach," Dan said, grabbing his towel. The Iowa State University Aquatic Center was his second home, the place where he'd spent countless hours perfecting his stroke, building the strength that had earned him a full scholarship and national recognition. "I can feel it happening. Everything's finally coming together." Peterson nodded, making notes on his clipboard. "Your butterfly stroke has improved dramatically this season. If you can shave another second off your time at nationals, you'll be in serious contention for the Olympic trials." Dan couldn't suppress his grin. He'd been swimming competitively for 14 years, dedicating his entire existence to this sport. Early morning practices, strict diets, social sacrifices, everything had led to this moment when Olympic qualification shifted from impossible dream to tangible goal. His phone buzzed in his gym bag. A text from Morgan. "Can't wait to see you tonight. Have something important to tell you." Morgan Hayes had been his girlfriend for 2 years, a journalism major with dreams as big as his own. She understood the sacrifices required for elite-level competition, never complaining about the hours he spent in the pool or the strict regimen that governed his life. She was his anchor, the person who kept him grounded when the pressure of competition threatened to overwhelm him. After showering and changing, Dan drove his aging Honda Civic across campus to Morgan's apartment. The October evening was crisp, autumn leaves painting the Iowa landscape in brilliant oranges and reds. Life felt perfect, like all the pieces of his future were finally aligning exactly as he'd always imagined they would. Morgan greeted him at the door with an unusual expression, nervous excitement mixed with something Dan couldn't quite identify. She was beautiful as always, her auburn hair catching the porch light. But there was a tension in her green eyes that immediately put him on alert. "How was practice?" she asked, leading him into her small living room. "Amazing. Coach thinks I have a real shot at the Olympics if I can drop my time at nationals." Dan settled onto the couch, pulling her down beside him. "But you said you had something important to tell me. What's going on?" Morgan took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for something on the coffee table. When she turned back to him, she was holding a small white stick that made Dan's world suddenly tilt off its axis. "I'm pregnant," she whispered. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Dan stared at the pregnancy test, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. 2 pink lines. Positive. His Olympic dreams, his carefully planned future, everything he'd worked for, it all seemed to shift and blur like a mirage, dissolving in desert heat. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Morgan nodded, tears beginning to stream down her cheeks. "I took 3 tests. They were all positive. Dan, I'm so sorry. I know this isn't what we planned. I know it complicates everything with your swimming and the Olympics." Dan's initial shock began morphing into something else. Panic, fear, and underneath it all, a growing sense that his entire life was about to change in ways he couldn't control. He'd been so focused on his goals, so certain about his path, that the possibility of an unplanned pregnancy had never seriously crossed his mind. "How far along?" he managed to ask. "About 6 weeks, I think. I've been feeling sick in the mornings, and when I missed my period..." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I should have told you sooner, but I wanted to be certain." Dan stood and began pacing the small room, his athlete's mind automatically calculating timing and logistics. Nationals were in 4 months. The Olympics were less than 2 years away. A baby would change everything. Their finances, their living situation, his ability to maintain his training schedule. How could he possibly balance elite-level competition with fatherhood? "We can figure this out," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Maybe I can still make it work. Other athletes have managed to compete while having families." Morgan looked up at him with hope and desperation. "Really? You think so?" Before Dan could answer, his phone rang. Coach Peterson's name appeared on the screen. "Dan, we need to talk," Peterson said without preamble. "I just got off the phone with USA Swimming. There's been a development with the national team training program. They want to invite you to train with the Olympic development squad starting in January. This could be huge for your qualification chances." Dan's heart soared and plummeted simultaneously. The opportunity he'd dreamed of his entire life was being offered at the exact moment when everything else was falling apart. That's incredible, Coach," Dan said, his eyes meeting Morgan's. "Can I call you back? I'm dealing with something right now." "Of course. But Dan, this is the chance we've been waiting for. Don't let anything distract you from what's important." After hanging up, Dan slumped back onto the couch. Morgan reached for his hand, her touch both comforting and overwhelming. "That was about the Olympics, wasn't it?" she asked quietly. Dan nodded. "They want me to train with the Olympic development team. It's everything I've ever wanted, Morgan. But now..." He gestured helplessly at the pregnancy test still lying on the coffee table. They talked long into the night, exploring options that all seemed inadequate. Dan's swimming scholarship covered his education and basic expenses, but barely. Adding a baby to their financial equation would be catastrophic. Yet as they talked, as Dan watched Morgan's hand unconsciously move to her still flat stomach, something unexpected began stirring in his chest. For the first time in his life, something was competing with swimming for his attention and winning. Over the following weeks, Dan threw himself into training with renewed intensity, as if he could outswim his confusion and fear. His times improved steadily, but his mind was constantly divided. During team meetings, while Coach Peterson discussed race strategy and technique refinements, Dan found himself researching baby costs and wondering how he could possibly afford diapers on a student-athlete's budget. Morgan had moved past her initial terror and embraced the pregnancy with characteristic determination. She'd already started prenatal vitamins and made an appointment with the campus health center. Her strength amazed Dan, but it also intensified his own feelings of inadequacy. How could he be the father this child needed while pursuing his Olympic dreams? 3 weeks after learning about the pregnancy, Dan was driving back from an evening practice session when his phone buzzed with a text from Morgan. "At the doctor. Can you come? Something's wrong." Dan's blood turned to ice water. He made an illegal U-turn and raced toward the medical center, his mind conjuring worst-case scenarios. When he burst into the waiting room, Morgan was sitting in a plastic chair, her face pale but not devastated. "What's wrong? Is the baby okay?" Dan asked, dropping into the seat beside her. Morgan looked at him with an expression he couldn't read: shock, amazement, and something that might have been terror. "The baby's fine," she said slowly. "Babies, actually. Dan, we're having twins." If the initial pregnancy announcement had tilted Dan's world, this news sent it spinning completely out of control. Twins, 2 babies. Double the expenses, double the responsibility, double everything that was already threatening to derail his Olympic aspirations. Twins, he repeated, the word feeling foreign on his tongue. 2 girls, Morgan added, a smile beginning to break through her shock. The doctor says they're both healthy and developing normally. Dan stared at the ultrasound image Morgan handed him. 2 small forms, barely distinguishable but undeniably real. His daughters. The concept was so overwhelming that his mind simply couldn't process it. He was going to be a father to twin girls, and his carefully constructed future was crumbling around him. That night, unable to sleep, Dan drove to the university pool and let himself in with his key card. The natatorium was dark, except for the emergency lighting, the water perfectly still and mirror-like. He'd done some of his best thinking in this space, but tonight the familiar environment offered no clarity. He dove in without bothering to change, his clothes dragging through the water as he swam lap after lap, trying to exhaust the anxiety that was consuming him. Everything he'd worked for, every sacrifice he'd made, every early morning and missed social event, it had all been building toward one goal, and now that goal was slipping away, not because he lacked talent or dedication, but because life had intervened in a way he'd never anticipated. By the time he climbed out of the pool, Dan had made a decision that surprised him. He was going to find a way to make it all work. He would train harder, manage his time better, find additional sources of income. He would be the father his daughters needed, and the Olympian he'd always dreamed of becoming. Somehow, impossibly, he would have both. The next few months blurred together in a haze of intensified training, part-time jobs, and pregnancy appointments. Dan took a position at a local sporting goods store, working evenings and weekends to save money for baby expenses. His training schedule became even more rigorous as he tried to compress his pool time into smaller windows. He was exhausted constantly, but his times continued to improve. Coach Peterson noticed the changes in Dan's demeanor, but attributed them to pre-competition nerves. "You seem distracted lately," he observed after a particularly strong practice session. "Everything okay?" Dan hadn't told his coach about the pregnancy yet, afraid that the news might affect his standing on the team. "Just focused on nationals," he replied, which was partially true. "Good, because I got another call from USA Swimming yesterday. They're very interested in your progress. If you can hit your target time at nationals, you'll almost certainly make the Olympic trials team." The pressure was mounting from all directions. Morgan was now showing, her body changing daily as their daughters grew inside her. She'd had to drop some of her courses due to severe morning sickness, putting her own graduation timeline in jeopardy. Their tiny apartment felt smaller each day as they accumulated baby gear from garage sales and generous friends. Dan's body was holding up to the increased demands, but just barely. He was swimming faster than ever, but the mental stress was taking its toll. He found himself making uncharacteristic errors during practice, losing focus at crucial moments. The sport that had once been his refuge was becoming another source of pressure. One evening in February, 3 weeks before nationals, Dan was driving home from work when his phone rang. Morgan's number appeared on his dashboard display. "Dan, it's time," she said, her voice tight with pain. "The contractions started an hour ago. They're getting stronger." Dan's heart stopped. "But you're only 36 weeks. It's too early." "The doctor said twins often come early. I'm at the hospital now. My mom drove me. You need to get here." Dan made the 20-minute drive to the hospital in 12 minutes, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles went white. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. Morgan wasn't due for another month. Nationals were in 3 weeks. Everything was happening too fast, too soon, too chaotically. He found Morgan in a labor and delivery room, her face flushed and sweaty, but determined. Her mother sat beside the bed, holding Morgan's hand and offering quiet encouragement. "How are you doing?" Dan asked, kissing Morgan's forehead. "Better now that you're here," she replied, squeezing his hand as another contraction hit. "The doctor says everything looks good. The babies are small, but healthy." The next 8 hours were the longest of Dan's life. He'd never felt so helpless, so completely out of control. All his training, his physical strength, his mental discipline, none of it mattered in that delivery room. He could only hold Morgan's hand and watch as she did the hardest work either of them had ever experienced. Olivia came first at 3:17 a.m., weighing 4 pounds 2 ounces. Her cry filled the room like a battle cry, announcing her arrival to the world. 7 minutes later, Ava joined her sister, slightly smaller at 3 pounds 15 ounces, but equally determined to make her presence known. Dan held his daughters for the first time as the sun was rising over Iowa City. They were impossibly small, their skin translucent and fragile, but perfect in every way he could imagine. As he looked down at their tiny faces, something fundamental shifted inside him. The panic and fear that had consumed him for months transformed into something else entirely, a fierce, overwhelming love unlike anything he'd ever experienced. "They're beautiful," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. Morgan smiled weakly from the hospital bed. "They look like you." For 3 days, Dan barely left the hospital. The girls had to stay in the NICU due to their size, but their vital signs were strong and they were feeding well. Dan spent hours watching them through the glass, marveling at their tiny fingers and the way they seemed to instinctively reach for each other. Coach Peterson called on the second day, wondering where Dan was. He'd missed 2 crucial practices leading up to nationals. "Family emergency," Dan explained, which was technically true if not complete. "Dan, nationals are in 2 weeks. You can't afford to miss training sessions now. Whatever's going on, it needs to wait until after the competition." For the first time in his swimming career, Dan felt a flash of anger toward his coach. "Some things are more important than swimming," he said, then immediately regretted the words. Peterson's silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. "We'll discuss this when you get back to training," he said finally, and hung up. Dan knew he'd crossed a line, but he couldn't bring himself to care. His daughters needed him here. Everything else, including his Olympic dreams, would have to wait. When the girls were finally released from the hospital, Dan and Morgan brought them home to an apartment that suddenly seemed completely inadequate. They'd done their best to prepare, cribs squeezed into the bedroom, baby supplies stacked wherever they could find space, but nothing could have prepared them for the reality of caring for premature twins. The first few weeks were a blur of feedings, diaper changes, and sleepless nights. Dan had returned to training, but his performance suffered dramatically. He was exhausted, distracted, and emotionally pulled in directions he'd never experienced. During what should have been his final preparation for nationals, he was swimming slower than he had in 2 years. "What's going on with you?" Coach Peterson demanded after a particularly poor practice. "You're swimming like you've never seen a pool before. Nationals are in 3 days, Dan. 3 days to qualify for the Olympics, and you're falling apart." Dan looked around the natatorium, the space that had been his sanctuary for so many years. For the first time, it felt foreign, like he no longer belonged there. His real life was at home with Morgan and his daughters, not chasing times on a stopwatch. "Coach, I need to tell you something," Dan began, then shared the story he'd been hiding for months. Peterson listened in stunned silence as Dan explained about the pregnancy, the premature birth, and the impossible balancing act he'd been attempting. "You've been dealing with this alone for 6 months, Peterson asked when Dan finished. "Dan, why didn't you tell me? We could have worked together to find solutions." "I was afraid you'd think I wasn't committed enough, that having a family would hurt my chances." Peterson was quiet for a long moment. "Having a family changes everything," he said finally. "But it doesn't have to end your career if you don't want it to. We just need to be realistic about timing and priorities." They decided together that Dan would compete at nationals despite his recent struggles. Even if he didn't qualify for the Olympics this cycle, the experience would be valuable for future competitions. Dan felt relief at finally sharing his situation, but also a growing awareness that his relationship with swimming was fundamentally changing. Nationals took place in Omaha, Nebraska, a 3-hour drive from Iowa City. Morgan was still recovering from the birth and couldn't travel with newborn twins, so Dan made the trip alone with Coach Peterson and the rest of the team. The competition was held at the same venue where Olympic trials would take place later that year. The pool was massive, the crowd enormous, and the energy electric. Dan had competed at nationals twice before, but this felt different. The stakes were higher, and his mindset was completely altered. In the ready room before his signature event, the 200-meter butterfly, Dan closed his eyes and tried to find the focused state of mind that had always served him in competition. Instead of visualizing his race strategy, he found himself thinking about Olivia and Ava, probably sleeping in their cribs while Morgan dozed in the chair between them. His warm-up felt sluggish, his stroke rhythm slightly off. Coach Peterson pulled him aside before he reported to the blocks. "Whatever happens out there, you've already accomplished something incredible this season," Peterson said. "Your time at conference championships was outstanding. Regardless of what happens today, just swim your race and let the chips fall where they land." Dan nodded, but he could see the disappointment in his coach's eyes. They both knew he wasn't swimming at his peak level, and at this level of competition, even small deficits were magnified exponentially. The call room was silent, except for the muffled sounds of the crowd outside. Dan sat on the bench with 7 other swimmers, the fastest men in America at their distance. 2 years ago, being in this room would have felt like the culmination of everything he'd worked for. Now it felt like borrowed time, a brief detour from his real life. "Swimmers, time to go," the official announced. The walk from the call room to the competition pool always felt endless. Dan's legs were loose and ready, but his mind was elsewhere. As he stepped onto the deck, the noise hit him like a physical force. Thousands of spectators cheering for the swimmers emerging behind the blocks. Dan took his position behind lane 4, shaking out his arms and bouncing on his toes. The pool stretched before him like an old friend, familiar and welcoming despite the high-stakes environment. He'd swum this distance thousands of times, but never with so much personal turmoil beneath the surface. "Swimmers, take your mark," the starter announced. Dan bent forward, gripping the starting block, his body coiled and ready. In the silence before the starting signal, he heard his heartbeat and thought one more time about his daughters. The electronic tone echoed through the natatorium. Dan's start was clean, his entry sharp and controlled. The first 50 meters felt smooth, his stroke rhythm finding its natural cadence despite his recent struggles. He surfaced near the middle of the pack, exactly where his strategy called for him to be. Swimming had always been Dan's meditation, the place where his mind could quiet and his body could perform with instinctive precision. For brief moments during the race, he found that familiar state, his stroke lengthening and his pace increasing as he settled into his rhythm. At the 100-meter turn, Dan was in 3rd place, close enough to the leaders to make a move on the back half of the race. Coach Peterson was on the deck, shouting encouragement that was mostly lost in the crowd noise. But Dan could see his animated gesturing from the corner of his eye. The third 50 meters were where Dan had always excelled, maintaining his stroke rate while others began to fade. He could feel his body responding despite the fatigue of the past few months, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought failed. He moved into 2nd place with 40 meters to go. The final 25 meters of a 200-meter butterfly were always a battle against lactic acid and oxygen debt. Dan's shoulders burned and his lungs screamed for air, but he'd trained for this moment his entire adult life. He could see the swimmer in lane 3 beginning to fade, opening up a possible path to victory. With 10 meters remaining, Dan was even with the leader, matching stroke for stroke. The crowd was on its feet, the noise deafening. Everything Dan had sacrificed, every early morning practice, every missed social event, had led to this moment. He touched the wall and immediately looked to the scoreboard. Second place, 2 minutes, 19.4 seconds. A personal best by 0.6 of a second, but still 0.3 away from the Olympic trials qualifying standard. Dan floated in the water for a moment, processing the result. He'd swum faster than ever before, but it wasn't enough. His Olympic dreams would have to wait at least 4 more years, and by then, his life would be completely different. Coach Peterson was waiting when Dan climbed out of the pool, his expression a mixture of pride and disappointment. "That was beautiful swimming," Peterson said, embracing Dan. "I know it wasn't the result we wanted, but you dropped significant time under incredibly difficult circumstances. I've never been prouder of an athlete." Later that evening, Dan called Morgan from his hotel room. She answered on the first ring, her voice tired but alert. "How did it go?" she asked. "Personal best, but I missed the qualifying time," Dan said. "I'm not going to the Olympics this year." He expected to feel devastated sharing this news, but instead, he felt something unexpected: relief. "I'm sorry, babe," Morgan said softly. "I know how much this meant to you." "Actually," Dan said, "I think I'm okay with it. I want to come home and be with you and the girls. That feels more important right now than anything else." The drive home from Omaha gave Dan time to process the end of one chapter of his life and the beginning of another. He'd been chasing Olympic qualification for so long that he'd never seriously considered what would come after swimming. Now, with 2 daughters depending on him, he needed to think practically about careers and stability in ways that had never occurred to him as a college athlete. When he walked into their apartment, Morgan was nursing both girls simultaneously, a skill she'd developed out of necessity. The sight of his family, tired, overwhelmed but together, filled Dan with a sense of purpose that competition had never provided. "How are my girls?" he asked, kissing each baby's forehead before settling beside Morgan on the couch. "Olivia's been fussy today, but Ava slept for 3 straight hours this afternoon," Morgan reported. "I actually managed to shower and eat a real meal." Dan took Olivia from Morgan's arms, marveling again at how perfectly she fit against his chest. At 7 weeks old, she was starting to make eye contact and respond to voices. Ava was slightly smaller, but seemed more alert, following sounds and movements with intense concentration. "I've been thinking about what comes next," Dan said. "Swimming's been my whole identity for so long. I'm not sure who I am without it." Morgan shifted Ava to her shoulder and reached for Dan's free hand. "You're their father. You're my partner. You're someone who just swam a personal best at the biggest meet of your career. You're a lot of things besides just a swimmer." Over the following months, Dan gradually transitioned away from competitive swimming. He continued training with the university team through the end of the season, but his heart was no longer in competition. Coach Peterson understood and helped Dan explore opportunities to stay involved in the sport in other capacities. Dan began teaching swim lessons at local clubs and eventually started coaching age group swimmers. The work paid modestly, but allowed him flexibility to help with the twins. He discovered he had a natural talent for instruction, breaking down complex techniques in ways young athletes could understand and implement. Morgan returned to her journalism studies when the girls were 3 months old, determined to finish her degree. They developed a complex schedule of shared childcare responsibilities that left both of them exhausted but functional. Money was constantly tight, and their social lives became non-existent, but they were managing. The twins grew rapidly, developing distinct personalities that delighted and challenged their parents. Olivia was outgoing and vocal, demanding attention and entertainment. Ava was quieter but more observant, studying her environment with intensity that reminded Dan of his own focus during competition. By the time the girls were 6 months old, Dan had found a rhythm that felt sustainable, if not entirely comfortable. He coached 3 different age group teams, taught private lessons, and worked weekend shifts at the sporting goods store. The schedule was exhausting, but the combined income allowed them to stay afloat financially. And then, on a Tuesday evening in October, everything changed again. Dan was driving home from coaching practice, listening to sports radio and thinking about stopping for groceries, when an SUV ran a red light and slammed into the driver's side of his Honda Civic at 45 miles per hour. The impact sent Dan's car spinning across the intersection and into a telephone pole. The last thing he remembered was the sound of crushing metal and breaking glass. Then, absolute darkness. Dan awoke 3 days later in the intensive care unit at University of Iowa hospitals, his body immobilized and connected to machines he didn't recognize. The first face he saw was Morgan's, streaked with tears and exhaustion. "Dan? Can you hear me?" she asked, leaning close to the bed. He tried to respond, but discovered a breathing tube in his throat. Panic began rising in his chest as he attempted to assess his condition. He couldn't feel his legs. He couldn't move his arms. The steady beeping of monitors filled the silence as reality began settling around him like a heavy blanket. A doctor appeared beside Morgan, tall, gray-haired, with the serious expression Dan had learned to associate with bad news. "Dan, I'm Dr. Martinez, your trauma surgeon," the doctor said. "You've been unconscious for 3 days following a severe car accident. I need to explain your injuries, and I want you to listen carefully." The words that followed changed Dan's life forever. The impact had caused catastrophic trauma to both of Dan's arms. Despite 12 hours of emergency surgery and the efforts of the hospital's best orthopedic team, both limbs had to be amputated at the shoulder. Additional injuries included 3 broken ribs, a punctured lung, and a severe concussion, but those would heal. His arms would not. Dan felt his world collapse with a completeness that made his Olympic disappointment seem trivial by comparison. Swimming hadn't just been his sport, it had been his identity, his livelihood, his passion, and his plan for supporting his family. Without arms, he wasn't just unable to swim competitively, he was unable to do most of the basic tasks that defined independent adult life. The next few weeks passed in a haze of medical procedures, insurance conversations, and physical therapy assessments. Dan learned new vocabulary: prosthetics, adaptive equipment, disability benefits, occupational therapy. Each term represented another aspect of a life he'd never imagined living. Morgan became his constant advocate, researching treatment options, arguing with insurance companies, and somehow continuing to care for 6-month-old twins while spending most of her time at the hospital. Her strength amazed Dan, but it also intensified his feelings of helplessness and guilt. "This isn't what you signed up for," Dan told her one afternoon as she helped him drink water through a straw. "You didn't agree to marry an invalid who can't even hold his own children." Morgan's response was immediate and fierce. "Don't you ever say that again? You're my partner, the father of my daughters, and the man I love. An accident doesn't change any of that." But Dan could see the strain in her eyes, the exhaustion in her posture. She was carrying the entire weight of their family alone, and he was contributing nothing except medical bills they couldn't afford. When Dan was finally released from the hospital, their small apartment had been modified by friends and volunteers. Grab bars in the bathroom, a hospital bed in the living room, adaptive equipment everywhere. The space that had felt cramped with baby gear now felt like a medical facility, constant reminders of everything Dan had lost. The twins had changed dramatically during the month he'd been hospitalized. They were sitting up, babbling constantly, and had developed strong preferences about food, toys, and routine. Dan watched them from his bed, unable to pick them up, unable to feed them, unable to participate in their care in any meaningful way. Morgan was finishing her degree through online courses, trying to position herself for better employment opportunities. Dan's coaching income had disappeared. His insurance through the university would end when he graduated, and disability benefits would cover only a fraction of their expenses. Financial pressure joined emotional trauma as constant sources of stress. Physical therapy began 6 weeks after the accident. Dan had lost significant muscle mass throughout his body, and his balance was severely compromised without arms for stabilization. Simple tasks like standing from a seated position required relearning and constant practice. The human body is remarkably adaptable, his occupational therapist, Sarah, explained during their first session. You'll be surprised what you can learn to do with your feet, your mouth, and assistive technology. It's not about replacing what you've lost. It's about finding new ways to accomplish the same goals. Dan appreciated her optimism, but privately doubted whether any adaptation could restore the life he'd been building. How could he support his family without the ability to work? How could he be the father his daughters deserved? How could he contribute to their household when he required assistance with basic personal care? Depression settled over Dan like a heavy fog. Some days he couldn't summon the energy to get out of bed, let alone participate in therapy or help with household tasks. He watched Morgan juggling childcare, schoolwork, and his care with growing resentment, not toward her, but toward his own helplessness. The insurance settlement from the accident provided some financial relief, but not nearly enough to address their long-term needs. The drunk driver who had caused the crash was uninsured and unemployed, offering no additional resources for recovery. Dan's medical bills continued mounting while his ability to generate income remained non-existent. Morgan graduated with her journalism degree in December, 6 months after Dan's accident. She'd completed her final semester while caring for twins and a disabled partner, an accomplishment that amazed everyone who knew their situation. But job prospects for recent journalism graduates were limited, especially in Iowa City. "I've been offered a position with the Des Moines Register," Morgan announced one evening as they sat in their living room. The twins were playing on a blanket on the floor, and Dan was practicing using adaptive utensils to feed himself dinner. "That's great news," Dan said, though he felt anything but celebratory. Des Moines was 2 hours away, requiring them to relocate just as he was beginning to establish relationships with medical providers and therapists. "It's not a great salary, but it's enough for us to get by," Morgan continued. "And Des Moines has better resources for adaptive services. There's a rehabilitation hospital there that specializes in helping people with limb differences learn to live independently." Dan nodded, but privately wondered if independence was a realistic goal. 8 months after losing his arms, he still required assistance with most basic tasks. The idea of caring for active toddlers while Morgan worked full-time seemed impossible. They moved to Des Moines in January, settling into a small rental house that ate up most of Morgan's salary. The twins, now walking and getting into everything, required constant supervision that Dan couldn't provide. He spent most days alone with them while Morgan worked, feeling overwhelmed and inadequate. Physical therapy in Des Moines was more intensive and specialized. Dan learned to use his feet for tasks he'd never imagined, developing flexibility and strength in his lower body that partially compensated for his lost upper body function. He could turn pages, operate light switches, and even type using adaptive equipment, but progress felt glacially slow. The emotional challenges proved more difficult than the physical ones. Dan had defined himself through physical achievement for so long that adapting to life with significant physical limitations felt like learning to be a completely different person. The confident athlete who had swum personal bests at national championships seemed like someone from another lifetime. Olivia and Ava celebrated their first birthday in a small celebration that highlighted how much their family's circumstances had changed. Dan watched from his wheelchair as Morgan organized games and helped the girls blow out candles on their cake. He couldn't pick them up when they fell, couldn't help with their food, couldn't participate in their care in the ways he'd imagined when they were born. Morgan was working long hours at the newspaper, covering local politics and community events. Her work was fulfilling, and she was gaining recognition for her reporting, but the demands left little time for family life. Dan felt like a burden rather than a partner, consuming resources without contributing meaningfully to their household. Financial stress remained constant. Dan's disability benefits helped, but they were insufficient to cover the costs of adaptive equipment, ongoing medical care and childcare when Morgan traveled for work. Dan investigated various work-from-home opportunities, but found most required capabilities he no longer possessed. 2 years after the accident, Dan reached his lowest point. The twins were walking, talking, and developing personalities that delighted everyone around them. But Dan felt disconnected from their lives. He couldn't chase them around the playground, couldn't help with bath time, couldn't even read them bedtime stories without assistance positioning books and turning pages. One particularly difficult evening, as Dan sat in his wheelchair watching Morgan handle both girls' dinner and bath routine alone, Ava walked over and climbed onto his lap. She settled against his chest and looked up at him with eyes that reminded him of his own. "Daddy sad?" she asked in her developing vocabulary. Dan felt tears building in his eyes. "Sometimes, sweetheart, but Daddy loves you very much." Ava patted his chest with her small hand. "Daddy's strong," she declared, with the certainty that only toddlers possess. That night, after the girls were in bed, Dan had a conversation with Morgan that changed the trajectory of their lives. "I've been thinking about going back to swimming," Dan said quietly. Morgan looked up from the laptop where she'd been editing an article. "What do you mean? Paralympic swimming? I've been researching it, and there are classifications for people with amputations. I could train again, maybe even compete." Morgan was quiet for a long moment. "Dan, that sounds wonderful. But how would it work practically? Training requires pool time, coaching, travel for competitions. We're barely managing our current expenses." "I know it sounds crazy," Dan continued, "but I've been researching grants and sponsorship opportunities for Paralympic athletes. There's funding available, especially for people with compelling stories. And I miss the water, Morgan. I miss feeling like I'm good at something, like I have something to contribute." Morgan closed her laptop and moved to the couch beside Dan's wheelchair. "If this is what you want to try, I'll support you completely. But I need you to be realistic about what it means for our family. Training at that level is a huge commitment." "I know, but maybe it's also an opportunity. If I could make the Paralympic team, there could be endorsement opportunities, speaking engagements, ways to generate income while doing something I love." The next morning, Dan called the Des Moines Aquatic Center and spoke with the head coach about adaptive swimming programs. To his surprise, they had several Paralympic athletes training there and were experienced with the modifications necessary for swimmers with various disabilities. "Come in tomorrow," Coach Williams said. "Let's see what you can do in the water." Dan hadn't been in a swimming pool since his accident nearly 2 years earlier. The thought of returning to the water filled him with equal parts excitement and terror. Swimming had been his identity for so long that he wasn't sure who he would be in the pool without arms. Morgan drove him to the aquatic center the next afternoon, with Olivia and Ava secured in car seats behind them. The familiar smell of chlorine hit Dan as they entered the building, triggering a flood of memories and emotions. Coach Williams was a woman in her 50s with graying hair and the lean build of a former competitive swimmer. She greeted Dan with professional warmth and introduced him to Marcus, a Paralympic veteran who had lost his left arm in a military training accident. "The water doesn't care what you're missing," Marcus said, as he helped Dan transfer from his wheelchair to the pool deck. "It only cares how efficiently you can move through it." Getting into the pool required assistance and adaptive equipment Dan had never used before. A mechanical lift lowered him into the water while Morgan watched nervously from the observation deck with the twins. The moment Dan's body entered the water, something inside him relaxed for the first time in 2 years. He floated on his back, allowing the water to support him completely. The sensation was both familiar and completely foreign. His body position was different without arms for balance, but the water itself felt like coming home. "Take your time," Coach Williams said from the pool deck. "Just get comfortable with how your body feels in the water now." Dan began with simple movements, using his legs and torso to propel himself through the water. His stroke mechanics were completely different, requiring him to generate all his power from his core and legs. It was exhausting and inefficient, but it was swimming. After 30 minutes in the water, Dan was physically drained but emotionally energized in ways he hadn't experienced since before his accident. The water had accepted him back, demanding adaptation but not rejecting his changed body. "You've got natural feel for the water," Coach Williams observed as Dan rested at the pool edge. "It's going to take time to develop technique and endurance, but you definitely have potential." That evening, Dan was more animated than Morgan had seen him in months. He talked excitedly about stroke techniques, training schedules, and Paralympic classification systems while helping put the twins to bed. "Daddy swim," Olivia said when Dan mentioned returning to the pool. "That's right, sweetheart. Daddy's going to learn to swim again." Over the following months, Dan established a training routine that worked around their family schedule. He trained early in the mornings before Morgan left for work, then again in the evenings after she returned. The twins often came to evening practices, playing in the viewing area while Dan worked on his technique. Progress was slower than Dan had hoped, but more significant than he dared expect. His endurance improved steadily, and he began developing stroke mechanics that maximized his available power sources. Coach Williams worked with him on starts and turns, crucial elements that required complete relearning without arms. Financial pressures remained intense. Training required pool fees, equipment, and eventually travel to competitions. Dan applied for every grant and sponsorship opportunity he could find, writing application essays that laid out his story and goals with brutal honesty. 6 months after returning to training, Dan competed in his first Paralympic qualifying event. The meet was held in Minneapolis, requiring their first family trip since the twins were born. Morgan took vacation days from work, and they drove north with a car packed with baby gear and Dan's adaptive swimming equipment. The competition was unlike anything Dan had experienced as an able-bodied swimmer. Athletes with every conceivable type of physical difference competed alongside each other, each using techniques adapted to their specific circumstances. The camaraderie and mutual support among competitors was unlike the individual focus Dan remembered from traditional swimming. Dan's first race was the 50-meter freestyle, an event that emphasized pure speed over endurance. He'd been working on his start for months, learning to generate explosive power from his legs alone. As he took his position on the starting block, he felt nervous energy that reminded him of his college competition days. The electronic tone sounded, and Dan launched himself into the pool with more force than he'd managed in practice. His entry was clean, and he surfaced in good position relative to the other swimmers in his classification. The race was only one length of the pool, requiring maximum effort for less than 40 seconds. Dan's stroke rate was higher than optimal, but his technique held together under race conditions. He could hear muffled cheering from the stands where Morgan and the twins were watching. As he approached the wall, he was in the middle of the pack, not winning, but competitive. He touched the wall and immediately looked to the scoreboard. 6th place out of 8 swimmers, with a time of 38.2 seconds. It wasn't fast by Paralympic standards, but it was a legitimate competitive time achieved less than a year after returning to training. Coach Williams was beaming when Dan climbed out of the pool. "That was outstanding for your first competition," she said. "You dropped 3 seconds from your best practice time. Racing brings out things in athletes that training never can." Morgan was crying when Dan found his family in the stands. "I'm so proud of you," she said, holding both twins while they squirmed to get down and explore. "Daddy, fast!" Ava declared, which made Dan laugh despite his exhaustion. The drive home from Minneapolis was filled with conversation about future competitions, training modifications, and the possibility of qualifying for national-level events. Dan felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced since before his accident, but he was also realistic about the challenges ahead. Training intensified over the following year. Dan added events and worked with a sports psychologist to develop mental preparation techniques. His times dropped steadily, and he began placing higher in regional competitions. Most importantly, he was generating modest income through sponsorships and speaking engagements about his comeback story. The twins were now 3 years old, full of energy and curiosity about their father's unusual profession. They spent countless hours at the pool, developing their own comfort in the water while Dan trained. Olivia showed particular interest in swimming, often asking when she could start lessons. Morgan's career was also advancing. She'd been promoted to senior reporter and was covering more significant stories throughout Iowa. Her work provided stability for their family, but she was beginning to express interest in pursuing opportunities in larger markets. "I've been offered a position with the Chicago Tribune," Morgan announced one evening as they prepared dinner together. "It's a significant step up in terms of visibility and salary." Dan felt his stomach tighten. Chicago was 4 hours from Des Moines, far from his training base and support network. "That's amazing," he said, trying to sound enthusiastic. "What would it mean for your schedule?" "More travel, longer hours initially, but also better long-term prospects," Morgan replied. "And Chicago has excellent Paralympic training facilities. It might actually be better for your swimming career too." They spent weeks discussing the implications of relocating again. Dan's training was progressing well in Des Moines, and he'd established relationships with medical providers and therapists who understood his needs. Moving to Chicago would mean starting over in many ways, but it could also provide opportunities that weren't available in Iowa. The decision was made when Dan qualified for the Paralympic trials in the 100-meter backstroke, his strongest event. The trials would be held in Minneapolis, and making the Paralympic team would require finishing in the top 2 in his classification. It was the opportunity he'd been working toward for nearly 2 years. They moved to Chicago in the spring, settling into a suburb with good schools and access to training facilities. Morgan's new position was demanding but rewarding, covering major political stories that had national implications. Dan found a training group at a private club that specialized in Paralympic preparation. The twins adapted to their new environment with the resilience of young children, quickly making friends and exploring their neighborhood. They were becoming increasingly independent, which allowed Dan more flexibility in his training schedule. Training in Chicago was more intensive than anything Dan had experienced. His new coach, Elena Rodriguez, was a former Olympic swimmer who had transitioned to coaching Paralympic athletes after her competitive career ended. She pushed Dan harder than he'd been pushed since his college days, demanding technical precision and mental toughness. "You have the physical tools to make the Paralympic team," Elena told Dan after a particularly demanding practice. "The question is whether you have the mental strength to perform when everything is on the line." Dan's times continued dropping as the trials approached. He was ranked 4th in his classification nationally in the 100-meter backstroke, putting him in contention for one of 2 Paralympic team spots. The margin between making the team and missing it would likely be measured in hundredths of a second. 3 months before trials, Dan received news that changed his perspective on competition entirely. A documentary filmmaker who'd been following Paralympic athletes for several years approached him about featuring his story in a film about comeback athletes. The project would provide significant exposure and financial compensation regardless of his trials results. Your story resonates with people because it's about more than just swimming, the filmmaker David Chen explained during their first meeting. It's about finding purpose after tragedy, about redefining success, about the lengths we'll go to make our children proud. The documentary crew began following Dan's training and family life, capturing the daily realities of balancing elite athletic preparation with parenting responsibilities. The twins were natural performers, charming the camera crew and providing moments of levity during intense training footage. As trials approached, Dan felt pressure from multiple directions. Media attention was increasing, with local news stations running features about his comeback attempt. Sponsors were watching his results closely, with potential endorsement deals dependent on his performance. Most importantly, he felt the weight of expectation from his daughters, who had begun telling their friends that their daddy was going to the Olympics. "It's not the Olympics, sweetheart," Dan corrected Olivia one evening. "It's the Paralympics, which is different but equally important." "Will you win medals?" Ava asked, her 4-year-old logic simplifying the complexities of international competition. "I'm going to do my best," Dan replied. "Sometimes your best is enough to win, and sometimes it isn't. But what matters most is that you never give up trying." The week before trials, Dan's training was interrupted by a phone call that shook his confidence. His former college coach, Peterson, had been following Dan's comeback and wanted to offer encouragement. "I've watched your race videos online," Peterson said. "Your technique is remarkable considering everything you've overcome, but I want you to know that you've already won, regardless of what happens at trials." "What do you mean?" Dan asked. "You could have given up after the accident. You could have let tragedy define your life. Instead, you found a way to chase dreams again while being the father your daughters need. That's more impressive than any medal." Trials were held at the same Minneapolis pool where Dan had competed in his first Paralympic qualifying event 2 years earlier. The familiar environment provided comfort, but the stakes were exponentially higher. National media coverage, family expectations, and 2 years of intensive preparation had all led to this moment. Morgan and the twins arrived the day before Dan's event, along with both sets of grandparents and several family friends. The support was touching, but added to Dan's sense that everyone was watching and waiting for him to either fulfill or disappoint their expectations. The ready room before the 100-meter backstroke final was silent, except for the sound of swimmers going through their pre-race routines. Dan had qualified 3rd for the final, putting him in lane 6 with a clear view of the top 2 seeds in lanes 4 and 5. As he sat on the bench, Dan thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. 4 years earlier, he'd been a college swimmer dreaming of Olympic qualification. 2 failed relationships, premature twins, a devastating accident, and countless hours of rehabilitation had led him here, to a different pool, chasing different dreams, but still pursuing excellence. "Swimmers, time to go," the official announced. The walk to the competition pool felt both endless and instantaneous. Dan could hear his family cheering from the stands, their voices distinct even in the crowd noise. The pool stretched before him like a familiar friend, the same distance he'd swum thousands of times, but under circumstances he could never have imagined. Lane introductions echoed through the natatorium as each swimmer was announced to the crowd. When Dan's name was called, the cheers were noticeably louder, a testament to the media coverage his story had received. Swimming in lane 6, from Chicago, Illinois, Dan Smith. Dan waved to the crowd with the prosthetic arm he used for ceremonial occasions, then removed it and handed it to his coach. In the water, he would rely entirely on his adapted technique and the strength he'd built over 2 years of intensive training. The warm-up pool had felt good that morning, his stroke rhythm smooth and his starts explosive. Now, facing the most important race of his comeback, Dan felt surprisingly calm. He'd done everything possible to prepare for this moment, and the outcome was beyond his control. "Swimmers, prepare for backstroke start," the starter announced. Dan lowered himself into the water and positioned his feet against the starting wall. Backstroke starts were one aspect of swimming where his disability provided no disadvantage. The explosive push off the wall came entirely from leg strength, which Dan had developed to levels that exceeded most able-bodied swimmers. "Swimmers, take your mark." The pool fell silent. Dan coiled his body, ready to explode backward into the water on the starting signal. In that moment of absolute stillness, he thought about Olivia and Ava watching from the stands, about Morgan sacrificing her evening to be there, about all the people who had supported his unlikely journey back to competitive swimming. The electronic tone shattered the silence. Dan's start was perfect, his body arcing through the air before knifing into the water with minimal splash. He surfaced in excellent position, matching stroke for stroke with the swimmers in the lanes beside him. The first 25 meters felt effortless, his technique holding together under the pressure of competition. At the 50-meter turn, Dan was in second place, exactly where he needed to be to make the Paralympic team. His flip turn was clean and explosive, launching him into the back half of the race with confidence building in his chest. The third 25 meters were where Dan had always excelled, maintaining his stroke rate while others began to fade. He could sense the swimmer in lane 5 starting to struggle, opening up space that Dan could exploit. The crowd noise was building, indicating a close race developing. With 15 meters remaining, Dan moved into the lead for the first time. His stroke was lengthening despite the oxygen debt building in his muscles, years of training allowing his technique to hold together when it mattered most. He could see lane 4 in his peripheral vision, the swimmer there making a final charge toward the wall. The final 10 meters of any race exist outside normal time, seconds stretching into infinity while bodies push beyond their normal limits. Dan's shoulders burned and his lungs screamed for oxygen, but his stroke rate remained steady. Everything he'd sacrificed, every early morning practice, every moment of doubt and determination had led to these final strokes. He touched the wall and immediately turned to look at the scoreboard, his vision blurry from exertion and adrenaline. The results seemed to take forever to appear, electronic timing systems calculating margins measured in hundredths of seconds. When the results flashed on the board, Dan felt his knees buckle, even though he was floating in the water. First place, 1:12:47, a personal best by over 2 seconds, and more importantly, a time that guaranteed his place on the Paralympic team. The pool erupted in cheers, but Dan heard none of it. He floated on his back, staring at the ceiling and processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. He was going to the Paralympics. He was going to represent his country in international competition. He had achieved something that seemed impossible 4 years earlier, when his world had collapsed in a hospital room. Coach Elena was crying when Dan reached the pool edge, her professional composure abandoned in the face of what they'd accomplished together. "That was beautiful swimming," she said, helping Dan out of the water. "I've never seen you race with that kind of controlled aggression." The media interviews that followed were a blur of cameras, microphones, and questions about his journey. Dan tried to articulate what the achievement meant to him, but words seemed inadequate to capture the emotional complexity of the moment. Later that evening, in the quiet of their hotel room, Dan sat with Morgan and the twins, the gold medal from his trials victory hanging around his neck. The girls had been allowed to stay up past their bedtime to celebrate, and they were fascinated by the weight and shine of the medal. "Are you proud of Daddy?" Morgan asked them. "Daddy's the fastest swimmer in the whole world," Olivia declared with 4-year-old certainty. Ava, always more thoughtful, looked up at Dan seriously. "Daddy, will you teach me to swim like you?" Dan felt tears building in his eyes. "I'll teach you anything you want to learn, sweetheart, but you don't have to be like me. You just have to be the best version of yourself." The months leading up to the Paralympics were a whirlwind of preparation, media appearances, and family adjustments. Dan's story had captured national attention, making him one of the most recognizable members of the Paralympic team. Endorsement opportunities materialized, providing financial security their family had never experienced. More importantly, Dan found himself becoming a spokesperson for adaptive sports and disability awareness. Speaking engagements at schools, corporations, and community events allowed him to share his message about resilience and redefining success. The income from these appearances exceeded anything he'd earned as a coach or instructor. The twins were now old enough to understand the significance of their father's achievements. They wore Team USA t-shirts to school and proudly told their classmates about the Paralympics. Dan was amazed by how naturally they accepted his disability, never seeing it as a limitation, but simply as part of who their father was. Morgan's career continued flourishing in Chicago. Her reporting on Dan's story had garnered national attention, leading to opportunities with major news networks. She was offered positions in New York and Los Angeles, but chose to remain in Chicago to support Dan's training and maintain stability for their daughters. The Paralympic Games were held in Paris, a venue that captured Dan's imagination from the moment the team arrived. The Paralympic Village was unlike anything he'd experienced, housing thousands of athletes with every conceivable type of physical difference, all united by their pursuit of athletic excellence. Dan's event schedule included 3 races: the 100-meter backstroke, where he was ranked second in the world, the 50-meter freestyle, where he was a long shot for medals, and the 100-meter freestyle, where he was considered a strong contender. Each race represented a different aspect of his development as a Paralympic swimmer. The opening ceremony was held in a stadium filled with 80,000 spectators and broadcast to millions worldwide. As Dan entered the stadium with Team USA, wearing the ceremonial prosthetic arms that allowed him to wave to the crowd, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. 4 years earlier, he'd been lying in a hospital bed convinced his life was over. Now, he was representing his country on sport's biggest stage, with his wife and daughters watching from the stands and millions more following his story around the world. Dan's first event, the 50-meter freestyle, was scheduled for the 3rd day of competition. It was his weakest event, but qualifying for the final would exceed most expectations and provide valuable racing experience for his stronger events later in the meet. The heats were held in the morning, with Dan seeded 6th out of 8 swimmers in his classification. The 50-meter freestyle required pure speed with no opportunity for tactical racing. It was simply about moving through the water as fast as possible for less than 30 seconds. Dan's warm-up felt good, his stroke rhythm smooth and his starts explosive. The Paris La Défense Arena was magnificent, with 15,000 spectators creating an atmosphere unlike anything he'd experienced in previous competitions. The energy was electric, befitting sport's second-largest international event. In the ready room, Dan went through his established pre-race routine, visualizing his race strategy and controlling his breathing to manage pre-competition nerves. The other swimmers in his heat were formidable competitors, including the world record holder and defending Paralympic champion. "This is what we've trained for," Dan reminded himself. "Trust your preparation and swim your own race." The call to the blocks came quickly. As Dan took his position in lane 7, he could see his family in the stands, Morgan holding a sign that read, "Go, Daddy, go," in the twins' handwriting. The sight filled him with calm determination. The starters' commands echoed through the arena. "Swimmers, take your mark." Dan coiled his body on the starting block, every muscle tensed and ready. In the silence before the starting signal, he thought about all the people who had supported his journey. Coach Eleanor, the medical team who had saved his life, the swimming community that had embraced his comeback. The electronic tone released him into the pool. Dan's start was near perfect, his body cutting through the water with minimal splash and surfacing in excellent position. The first 25 meters felt effortless, his stroke rate slightly higher than in training, but sustainable for the short distance. At the turn, Dan was in 4th place, close enough to the leaders to make a move on the back half. His flip turn was explosive, launching him toward the final 25 meters with confidence building in his chest. The sprint home was where Dan had improved most dramatically over the past year. His stroke lengthened instead of shortening under pressure, a sign of the technical work he'd done with Coach Elena. He could sense swimmers beside him beginning to fade as he maintained his rhythm. With 10 meters remaining, Dan was in 3rd place and gaining on the swimmers ahead of him. The crowd noise was deafening, indicating a close race developing across multiple lanes. Dan's final strokes were the strongest of the race, his technique holding together perfectly when it mattered most. He touched the wall and immediately looked to the scoreboard, his vision blurry from exertion, but clear enough to see what mattered most. A Q beside his name indicating he had qualified for the evening final. 3rd place in his heat, 6th place overall, and a new personal best time of 26.84 seconds. Dan had exceeded expectations in his first Paralympic event, setting himself up for potential medal contention in the final. Coach Elena was ecstatic when Dan reached the team area. "That was exceptional racing," she said. "You negative split the race by 4/10, which means you're swimming smarter and stronger than ever before." The evening session brought increased pressure and excitement. Dan's family had secured better seats for the finals, and the documentary crew was following his every move. Making the final was already a significant achievement, but now the possibility of Paralympic medals seemed within reach. Dan's warm-up for the final felt different from the morning session. His stroke was more relaxed, his confidence higher. He'd proven he belonged on this stage, and now he could race with the freedom that came from exceeded expectations. The ready room before the final was silent, except for the muffled roar of the crowd outside. Dan sat in lane 6, surrounded by the fastest Paralympic swimmers in his classification. 2 years earlier, he'd been learning to swim again with no arms. Now, he was preparing to race for Paralympic medals. "Swimmers, time to go," the official announced. The walk to the competition pool felt both familiar and surreal. Dan had visualized this moment countless times during training, but the reality exceeded his imagination. 15,000 people on their feet, television cameras from around the world, and his wife and daughters watching from the stands. Lane introductions were a ceremony unto themselves, each swimmer presented to the crowd with their personal achievements and national anthem playing softly in the background. When Dan's name was announced, the American contingent in the stands erupted in cheers. Swimming in lane 6 from the United States of America, Dan Smith. Dan waved with his ceremonial prosthetic, then removed it and handed it to Coach Elena. This was the moment of truth. No adaptive equipment, no assistance, just his rebuilt body against the water and his competitors. The pre-race routine was identical to the morning session, but the stakes were exponentially higher. Paralympic medals, national recognition, and personal vindication were all within reach if he could execute the race plan they'd practiced hundreds of times. "Swimmers, prepare for freestyle start," the starter announced. Dan stepped onto the starting block, the familiar platform feeling solid beneath his feet. The pool stretched ahead of him like an old friend, 50 meters of distance that would determine whether 4 years of struggle and preparation had been worthwhile. "Take your mark." Absolute silence fell over the arena. Dan coiled his body, ready to explode into the water with every ounce of power he'd developed. In that moment of stillness, he thought about Olivia and Ava watching from the stands, about the example he was setting for their lives. The starting signal shattered the silence. Dan launched himself into the pool with more force than he'd ever generated, his entry clean and his surfacing position perfect. The first strokes felt effortless despite the race pace, months of technical work allowing his body to perform instinctively under pressure. At 25 meters, Dan was in 5th place, but within striking distance of the medal positions. His turn was explosive, launching him into the back half of the race with confidence and controlled aggression. This was where he'd made his living throughout his comeback, maintaining technique and power when others began to fade. The third 25 meters belonged to Dan. His stroke rate remained steady, while swimmers around him began fighting the water instead of flowing through it. He moved into 4th place, then 3rd, the gap to 2nd place shrinking with every stroke. With 15 meters remaining, Dan was in 2nd place and gaining on the leader. The crowd was on its feet, the noise level incredible. Dan's stroke was lengthening instead of shortening, a sign that his preparation was holding together perfectly when it mattered most. The final 10 meters existed in a world outside normal time. Dan could sense the swimmer in lane 4 making a final charge, but his own technique remained solid. Every sacrifice, every moment of doubt, every hour in rehabilitation had led to these final strokes. Dan touched the wall and immediately turned toward the scoreboard, his heart hammering against his ribs. The results seemed to take forever to appear, electronic timing calculating margins that would determine the podium positions. When the final results flashed on the board, Dan felt his world shift again, but this time in ways he'd dreamed about for 2 years. 2nd place, 26.71 seconds, a Paralympic silver medal in his first games. The pool erupted in celebration. Dan floated on his back, looking up at the ceiling of the Paris Redefines arena and processing what had just occurred. He was a Paralympic medalist. He had achieved something that seemed impossible when he'd first returned to the water with no arms and massive doubts about his future. Coach Elena was crying at poolside, her emotions overwhelming her professional composure. "I've never seen anything like that race," she said as Dan reached the wall. "You found another gear when it mattered most." The medal ceremony that followed was the emotional culmination of Dan's journey. Standing on the podium with the silver medal around his neck, listening to the American national anthem while looking up at Morgan and the twins in the stands, Dan felt a completeness he'd never experienced even during his able-bodied swimming career. Olivia and Ava were bouncing in their seats, waving small American flags and shouting, "That's our daddy!" loud enough for nearby spectators to hear. Morgan was openly weeping, her hands pressed to her face as she watched her husband receive recognition for one of sport's greatest comeback stories. But Dan's Paralympic experience was far from over. He still had 2 more events to contest, including the 100-meter backstroke, where he was ranked 2nd in the world and considered a strong favorite for gold. The days between events passed in a blur of media interviews, drug testing protocols, and maintaining training routines. Dan's silver medal had generated enormous attention, with news outlets around the world covering his story. The documentary crew was ecstatic, knowing they'd captured something special for their film. More importantly for Dan, the medal had financial implications that would benefit his family for years to come. Endorsement opportunities were materializing daily, and speaking engagement requests were pouring in from organizations around the world. For the first time since his accident, Dan felt financially secure. The 100-meter backstroke was scheduled for the penultimate day of swimming competition. Dan's world ranking and recent performances made him the presumptive favorite. But Paralympic competition had taught him that rankings meant nothing when races were decided by hundredths of seconds. Dan's preparation for the backstroke was meticulous. It was his strongest event, the one where his adapted technique was most refined and his competitive advantage most pronounced. 2 years of technical refinement had created a stroke that was both powerful and efficient, perfectly suited to his body type and physical capabilities. The morning heats felt almost routine after his breakthrough performance in the freestyle. Dan qualified easily for the final, posting the fastest time of the morning and establishing himself as the swimmer to beat in the evening session. "You look completely relaxed out there," Coach Elena observed after the heat. "That's exactly the mindset we want for tonight. Confident, but not complacent." The afternoon provided time for rest and mental preparation. Dan spent time with his family, playing with the twins in the Paralympic Village playground and trying to maintain normal routines despite the extraordinary circumstances. Olivia and Ava were handling the excitement better than he'd expected, treating the Paralympics like an extended adventure rather than a pressure-filled competition. "Daddy, will you win another medal tonight?" Ava asked during their afternoon visit. "I'm going to do my best," Dan replied. "Sometimes your best is enough to win, and sometimes it isn't. But what matters is that you never give up trying." "We're proud of you no matter what," Olivia added, with 4-year-old wisdom that amazed Dan. The evening session brought familiar pressure and excitement, but Dan felt more prepared than he had for any race in his career. The 100-meter backstroke was his signature event, the distance and stroke where his adaptations were most refined and his competitive advantage most pronounced. Warm-up felt perfect. His stroke rhythm was smooth, his starts explosive, and his mental state calm and focused. The Paris La Défense arena was sold out again, with thousands of spectators creating an atmosphere that energized rather than intimidated Dan. In the ready room, Dan went through his established routine while studying the swimmers who would share the pool with him. The world record holder was in lane 4, the defending Paralympic champion in lane 5, and Dan in lane 3. The 3 fastest swimmers in the world at this distance and stroke. "This is why we train," Dan reminded himself. "This is what all the preparation has been building toward." The call to the blocks came with familiar ceremony. As Dan walked onto the pool deck, the American supporters in the stands recognized him immediately and began chanting his name. The sound was overwhelming and inspiring, a wall of encouragement from people who had followed his journey. Lane introductions were more elaborate for the premier events, with video montages showing each swimmer's path to the Paralympics. Dan's segment highlighted his accident, rehabilitation, and comeback, drawing emotional responses from spectators who were learning his story for the first time. Swimming in lane 3, from the United States of America, the silver medalist in the 50-meter freestyle, Dan Smith. Dan waved to the crowd, then prepared for the race that would define his Paralympic experience. This was his strongest event, his best chance for Paralympic gold, and the culmination of everything he'd worked toward since returning to competitive swimming. The pre-race routine was identical to every other competition, but the stakes were personal as well as athletic. This race would determine whether Dan was simply a successful Paralympic swimmer or something more, a champion who had overcome impossible odds to reach the pinnacle of his sport. "Swimmers, prepare for backstroke start," the starter announced. Dan lowered himself into the water and positioned his feet against the starting wall. The backstroke start was where he'd developed significant advantage over his competitors, his explosive leg power launching him into races with early leads that were often insurmountable. "Take your mark." The arena fell completely silent. Dan coiled his body against the wall, every muscle tensioned and ready. In that moment before the starting signal, he thought about the journey that had brought him here. From Olympic hopeful to car accident victim to Paralympic champion contender, The electronic tone released him into the race of his life. Dan's start was explosive, his body arcing through the air before cutting into the water with perfect technique. He surfaced with a clear lead over the field, his stroke immediately finding the rhythm that had carried him through 2 years of comeback preparation. The first 25 meters belonged entirely to Dan. His stroke was longer and more powerful than anyone else in the field, adapted technique that maximized his available power sources. At the first turn, he led by nearly a full body length, a significant margin in Paralympic swimming. The second 25 meters were about maintaining advantage while managing energy for the race's final stages. Dan's stroke rate remained steady, his technique holding together perfectly under the pressure of leading a Paralympic final. The swimmers behind him were world-class competitors, but they were chasing someone, swimming the race of his life. At 50 meters, Dan's lead had grown to nearly 2 seconds, an enormous margin in elite swimming. His turn was explosive, launching him into the back half of the race with confidence and controlled aggression. This was where his training would be tested, where months of preparation would determine whether he could maintain his advantage. The third 25 meters were where Dan had made his reputation throughout his Paralympic preparation. While other swimmers began fighting the water, his technique remained smooth and efficient. His lead was so substantial that he could see the swimmers behind him in his peripheral vision, all of them working desperately to close the gap. With 25 meters remaining, Dan was swimming the race of his life. His stroke was lengthening instead of shortening under pressure, a sign that his preparation was holding together perfectly when it mattered most. The crowd was on its feet, sensing they were witnessing something special. The final 25 meters of any Paralympic race exist in a dimension beyond normal competition. Dan's shoulders burned and his lungs screamed for oxygen, but his stroke rate remained steady. Every sacrifice he'd made, every moment of doubt he'd overcome, every hour of rehabilitation had led to this moment. He touched the wall and immediately knew he'd won. The margin of victory was so substantial that he could see the second-place finisher still approaching the wall as he looked back down the pool. The scoreboard confirmed what his instincts already knew: Paralympic gold medal, world record, and the race of his career. On 08:32, not only had Dan won Paralympic gold, but he'd broken the world record by over a second, a massive margin in elite swimming. The pool erupted in celebration unlike anything he'd experienced. 15,000 people on their feet acknowledging they'd witnessed something extraordinary. Dan floated on his back in the center of his lane, looking up at the ceiling of the Paris La Défense arena and trying to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. He was Paralympic champion. He was world record holder. He had achieved something that transcended sport and entered the realm of human inspiration. Coach Elena was sobbing at poolside, her professional composure completely abandoned. "That was the most beautiful race I've ever seen," she managed between tears. "You didn't just win, you dominated the best swimmers in the world." The victory ceremony was scheduled for later that evening, giving Dan time to celebrate with his family and process the emotional weight of his achievement. When he found Morgan and the twins in the family section, all 3 of them were crying. Morgan with joy and pride, the twins because they were overwhelmed by the crowd's reaction. "Daddy's the fastest swimmer in the whole world," Olivia declared, her 4-year-old understanding of the achievement perfectly capturing its significance. "Are we going to be on TV?" Ava asked, always practical despite the emotional chaos around her. "Probably, sweetheart," Dan replied, lifting both girls despite the physical challenge it presented. "But what matters most is that we're together, and we never gave up on our dreams." The medal ceremony that evening was the emotional culmination of Dan's journey from tragedy to triumph. Standing atop the Paralympic podium with gold around his neck, listening to the American national anthem while looking up at his family in the stands, Dan felt a completeness that exceeded anything he'd experienced as an able-bodied swimmer. The crowd's reaction was unprecedented for Paralympic swimming. 15,000 people on their feet, many openly weeping, acknowledging they'd witnessed one of the great comeback stories in Paralympic history. Dan's journey from car accident victim to world record holder had captured global attention and imagination. But as the ceremony concluded and Dan waved to the crowd one final time, he was already thinking about his final event, the 100-meter freestyle scheduled for the last day of swimming competition. He'd entered the Paralympics hoping to be competitive. Now he was carrying the expectations that came with being Paralympic champion and world record holder. The 100-meter freestyle presented different challenges than the backstroke. It wasn't Dan's strongest event, and his world ranking was lower than in his gold medal race. But his confidence was at an all-time high, and his preparation had been meticulous across all three events. The days between his backstroke victory and the freestyle were filled with media obligations, drug testing, and attempts to maintain normal routines despite extraordinary circumstances. Dan's gold medal had generated global attention, with news outlets from every continent covering his story. The documentary crew could barely contain their excitement, knowing they'd captured something unprecedented. More importantly, the victory had opened doors that would benefit Dan's family for decades to come. Corporate sponsors were lining up with endorsement offers, speaking bureaus were booking engagements months in advance, and publishers were expressing interest in his autobiography. For the first time since his accident, Dan felt not just financially secure, but genuinely prosperous. "This changes everything for our family," Morgan said, as they reviewed contract offers in their Paralympic Village apartment. "The girls' college funds, our retirement, the house we've always wanted, it's all possible now." Dan nodded, but his focus remained on the task at hand. "One more race first. I want to finish strong before we start thinking about what comes next." The morning of his final event, Dan felt different than he had before either previous race. The pressure was less intense. He'd already exceeded every reasonable expectation for his Paralympic debut. At the same time, his confidence was higher than it had ever been in competition. He was swimming faster than ever, his technique was refined to perfection, and he was racing with the freedom that came from having already achieved his primary goals. The 100-meter freestyle heats felt almost routine after his previous experiences. Dan qualified easily for the final, posting the third fastest time of the morning and establishing himself as a legitimate medal contender despite it being his weakest event. "You're swimming with complete confidence now," Coach Elena observed after the heat. "That gold medal has freed you up to race without fear or hesitation." The afternoon provided time for final preparations and family visits. Dan spent hours with Olivia and Ava, playing games and trying to maintain normal routines despite the extraordinary circumstances they were experiencing. The twins had adapted remarkably well to Paralympic life, treating the entire experience like an extended adventure. "Daddy, are you nervous about tonight?" Olivia asked during their afternoon visit. "A little bit," Dan replied honestly, "but I'm also excited. This is what we've been working toward for 2 years, and I get to do it with you and Mommy watching." "Will you win another gold medal?" Ava wondered. "I don't know, sweetheart. But I'm going to swim as fast as I possibly can, and that's all anyone can ask for." The evening session brought familiar energy and excitement, but Dan felt more relaxed than he had for any race in his Paralympic experience. He'd already achieved more than he dared dream when he first returned to competitive swimming. Now he could race with complete freedom, chasing excellence for its own sake rather than for external validation. Warm-up felt exceptional. His stroke was flowing, his starts were explosive, and his mental state was perfectly calibrated between relaxation and intensity. The Paris La Défense arena was packed again, with thousands of spectators who had followed Dan's story throughout the Games and wanted to witness the conclusion of his Paralympic journey. The ready room before his final race was quieter than usual, filled with swimmers who were completing their own Paralympic experiences. Dan sat in lane 5, surrounded by competitors who had pushed him to new levels of performance throughout the meet. 2 years earlier, he'd been learning to swim again with prosthetic equipment. Now, he was preparing to race the fastest Paralympic swimmers in the world. "This is what it's all been about," Dan reminded himself. "Every sacrifice, every hour of training, every moment of doubt has led to this opportunity." The call to the blocks carried additional ceremony for the final swimming session of the Paralympics. As Dan walked onto the pool deck for the last time, the crowd's recognition was immediate and overwhelming. Thousands of people chanting his name, waving American flags, and acknowledging they were witnessing the conclusion of something special. Lane introductions were emotional for Dan's final race, with video tributes to his entire Paralympic experience. His segment showed highlights from all 3 events, capturing the progression from silver medalist to world record holder to inspirational figure whose story transcended sport. Swimming in lane 5 from the United States of America, Paralympic champion and world record holder in the 100-meter backstroke, Dan Smith. Dan waved to the crowd with genuine gratitude, knowing this would be his final moment on the Paralympic stage for at least 4 years. The experience had exceeded every expectation and dream he'd harbored when he first returned to competitive swimming. The pre-race routine was identical to every other competition, but the emotional weight was different. This race would conclude not just his Paralympic experience, but potentially his entire comeback story. Everything that followed would build on the foundation established during these games. "Swimmers, prepare for freestyle start," the starter announced. Dan stepped onto the starting block for his final Paralympic race, the familiar platform feeling solid beneath his feet. 100 meters of distance that would determine how his debut Paralympic experience would be remembered. As a successful comeback highlighted by 1 gold medal, or as something even more extraordinary. "Take your mark." The arena fell silent for the final time. Dan coiled his body on the starting block, ready to give everything he had left after a week of competition that had already exceeded his wildest dreams. In that moment of stillness before the starting signal, he thought about the journey that had brought him here and the family watching from the stands. The starting tone released him into the race that would define the conclusion of his Paralympic story. Dan's start was near perfect, his body cutting through the water with minimal splash and surfacing in excellent position relative to the field. The first 25 meters felt effortless, despite the race pace, months of technical refinement allowing his stroke to flow naturally under pressure. At the first turn, Dan was in 4th place, but within striking distance of the medal positions. His flip turn was explosive, launching him into the second length with confidence and controlled aggression. This was where his preparation over the past 2 years would be tested against the world's best swimmers. The second 25 meters belonged to Dan. His stroke rate remained steady, while swimmers around him began fighting the water instead of flowing through it. He moved into 3rd place, then 2nd, the gap to the leader shrinking with every stroke. The crowd was building toward another crescendo, sensing another special performance developing. At 50 meters, Dan had moved into 2nd place and was gaining on the leader. His technique was holding together perfectly under the pressure of Paralympic competition, adapted stroke mechanics that maximized his available power sources. The swimmer in lane 4 was struggling to maintain his early pace, opening up opportunities for Dan to exploit. The third 25 meters were where Dan had made his reputation throughout his comeback preparation. While other swimmers began to fade, his stroke lengthened and his power increased. He moved into the lead for the first time with 30 meters remaining, his confidence building with every stroke. With 15 meters left in his final Paralympic race, Dan was swimming the performance of his life. His stroke was flowing effortlessly despite the oxygen debt building in his muscles, technique holding together when it mattered most. The swimmer in lane 6 was making a final charge, but Dan's preparation was proving superior to raw talent. The final 10 meters existed outside normal time and space. Dan's shoulders burned and his lungs screamed for air, but his stroke rate remained steady. Every sacrifice he'd made, every moment of rehabilitation, every hour of doubt and determination had led to these final strokes in his Paralympic debut. He touched the wall and immediately knew he'd won again. The margin wasn't as substantial as in the backstroke, but his technique had held together perfectly when it mattered most. The scoreboard confirmed what his instincts already knew. Another Paralympic gold medal, another world record, and a performance that would be remembered as one of the great Paralympic achievements. 55.23 seconds. Dan had not only won his second Paralympic gold medal, but he'd broken another world record in an event that wasn't considered his strongest. The pool erupted in celebration that surpassed even his backstroke victory. Acknowledgement that they'd witnessed something truly extraordinary. Dan floated in the center of his lane, looking up at the ceiling of the Paris Redefines arena one final time as a competing Paralympic athlete. He was a double Paralympic champion, double world record holder, and the author of one of sport's greatest comeback stories. More importantly, he was a father who had shown his daughters that no obstacle was insurmountable when faced with determination and support. Coach Elena was openly sobbing at poolside, her emotions overwhelming any attempt at professional composure. "I've never seen anything like what you've accomplished this week," she managed between tears. "You've redefined what's possible in Paralympic sport." The victory ceremony for Dan's second gold medal was even more emotional than the first. Standing atop the Paralympic podium for the final time, listening to the American national anthem while looking up at Morgan and the twins in the stands, Dan felt a completeness that exceeded anything he'd ever imagined possible. The crowd's reaction was unprecedented in Paralympic swimming. 15,000 people providing a standing ovation that lasted several minutes, acknowledging they'd witnessed one of the great individual performances in Paralympic history. Dan's journey from tragedy to triumph had captured global imagination and provided inspiration that transcended sport. But as the ceremony concluded and Dan waved to the crowd one final time as a competing Paralympic athlete, he was already thinking about what came next. His story had reached its athletic climax, but his real work, inspiring others and supporting his family, was just beginning. The days following competition were a whirlwind of media obligations, celebration events, and preparation for returning home to Chicago. Dan's achievements had generated international attention, with news outlets from around the world wanting to feature his story. The documentary crew was ecstatic, knowing they'd captured something that would resonate with audiences globally. More significantly, Dan's Paralympic success had created opportunities that would benefit his family for generations. Corporate sponsors were offering substantial endorsement contracts. Speaking bureaus were booking engagements worldwide, and publishers were competing for rights to his autobiography. The financial insecurity that had plagued their family since his accident was now a distant memory. "This changes everything," Morgan said as they reviewed contract offers in their hotel room. "The girls' education, our retirement, the foundation we talked about starting. It's all possible now." Dan nodded, but his thoughts were already moving beyond personal benefits. "I want to use this platform to help other people facing similar challenges. The money and recognition are wonderful, but they're not the point." "What do you mean?" Morgan asked. "I want to start a foundation that provides swimming opportunities for people with disabilities. I want to write a book that shows people they can overcome anything. I want to spend the rest of my life proving that setbacks don't have to be permanent." The flight home to Chicago was surreal. Dan traveled with 2 Paralympic gold medals, 2 world records, and a story that had captured global attention. Passengers and flight attendants approached him throughout the journey, sharing their own stories of overcoming obstacles and expressing gratitude for the inspiration his achievements had provided. But the most meaningful moment came when Olivia fell asleep against his chest during the transatlantic flight. her small hand resting on one of his gold medals. As Dan looked down at his daughter, he realized that his greatest achievement wasn't athletic. It was showing his girls that no challenge was too great when faced with determination and love. The homecoming in Chicago exceeded anything Dan could have imagined. Hundreds of people gathered at the airport, including reporters, Paralympic officials, and families affected by disability who had followed his story throughout the Games. The twins were overwhelmed by the attention, but handled it with remarkable grace for 4-year-olds. "Daddy's famous," Olivia announced to anyone within hearing distance, which made Dan laugh despite the emotional weight of the moment. "Daddy's the same person he's always been," Dan corrected gently. "He just got the chance to show the world what we always knew, that love and determination can overcome anything." The weeks following the Paralympics were filled with celebration events, sponsorship obligations, and the beginning of what would become Dan's post-competitive career. Speaking engagements took him across the country, sharing his story with corporate audiences, schools, and disability organizations. The response was overwhelming, with booking agents struggling to accommodate demand. The documentary about his comeback premiered at film festivals worldwide, earning critical acclaim and audience awards. The film's success led to additional media opportunities, including book deals and television appearances that further amplified Dan's message about resilience and redefinition. Most importantly for Dan, the Paralympic success created opportunities to establish the foundation he'd envisioned. The Dan Smith Foundation began providing swimming opportunities for children and adults with disabilities, offering equipment, coaching, and competitive opportunities that might otherwise be unavailable. "This is what it was all about," Dan told Morgan as they watched the Foundation's first group of young swimmers taking lessons at the Chicago facility. "The medals and records are nice, but this is what really matters." 6 months after the Paralympics, Dan received news that would provide the perfect conclusion to his comeback story. The International Paralympic Committee announced that he'd been selected as a nominee for the Wang Yun Dai Achievement Award, Paralympic sport's highest individual honor, recognizing athletes who embody the Paralympic values through their sporting achievements and contributions to society. The award ceremony was held at the Paralympic headquarters in Germany, with Dan's family traveling to witness the culmination of his journey from tragedy to triumph. As he accepted the award from the IPC president, Dan thought about the path that had led him there. From Olympic hopeful to car accident victim to Paralympic champion to global inspiration. "This award belongs to everyone who supported my journey," Dan said in his acceptance speech. "My wife Morgan, who never stopped believing. My daughters Olivia and Ava, who gave me reason to fight. My coaches and medical team who made recovery possible. And every person who faces challenges and refuses to surrender to them." But the most meaningful moment came later that evening, in the quiet of their hotel room, when Ava climbed onto Dan's lap and asked a question that encapsulated everything he'd learned from his journey. "Daddy, are you glad you got hurt in the car?" Dan was quiet for a long moment, considering how to answer such a profound question from his 4-year-old daughter. "I'm not glad it happened, sweetheart," he said finally, "but I'm grateful for what it taught me. It showed me that the most important things in life aren't the things we can hold in our hands. They're the love we share, the dreams we chase, and the strength we find when we think we have nothing left." "Like swimming with no arms?" Olivia asked. "Like swimming with no arms," Dan agreed. "And like being the best daddy I can be to the 2 most amazing girls in the world." As Dan looked at his daughters, he realized that his story had come full circle in ways he never could have anticipated. The accident that seemed to destroy his future had actually revealed his true purpose, not just as an athlete, but as a father, husband, and inspiration to others facing impossible odds. The twins were now old enough to understand that their father was different from other dads, but they'd never seen his disability as a limitation. To them, he was simply the strongest, fastest, most determined person they knew, someone who had taught them that love and persistence could overcome any obstacle. Years later, when Olivia and Ava were teenagers, and Dan was in his second career as a motivational speaker and foundation director, they would ask him about the darkest moments of his journey. He would tell them about lying in the hospital convinced his life was over, about the depression and financial struggles, about the times he wanted to quit training and accept limitations. But he would also tell them about the moment everything changed, when he realized that his greatest achievement wasn't swimming fast or winning medals, but showing them that setbacks don't have to be permanent, that love can overcome any obstacle, and that the most important victories happen not in pools or arenas, but in the daily choice to never give up on the people and dreams that matter most. Dan's story became one of the most celebrated comeback narratives in Paralympic history, but for him, the real victory was simpler and more profound. He had kept his promise to make his daughters proud, and in doing so, had discovered that sometimes life's greatest gifts come disguised as its worst tragedies. The accident that seemed to end his dreams had actually been the beginning of something far more meaningful, a life dedicated to proving that human spirit, when fueled by love and determination, is capable of achieving the impossible. If Dan's journey from tragedy to triumph inspired you, if his story of resilience in the face of impossible odds moved you to believe that your own challenges can be overcome, then you understand the power of never giving up on your dreams. Subscribe now to discover more incredible stories of human courage, determination, and the extraordinary heights we can reach when we refuse to let setbacks define our future. Like our video and see you tomorrow.